Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight from the HEKHAL Batei Knesset, the Synagogue Hall of Anu, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. A remarkable room which contains within it exquisite models of synagogues from around the world, as well as recreations of synagogue walls, such as that of the El Transito medieval synagogue of Toledo, Spain, in front of which I stand right now. I can think of no better place in which to conclude the Sanctuaries and Cities lecture series. And so I want to thank Shula Bahat of Anu Museum for making this all happen. And I want to thank as well Dan Tadmor of Anu for the incredible tour that he gave me today of the entire museum here at Anu. Before I begin the lecture series, I want to express my profound gratitude to those who have sponsored our entire series from beginning to end. TORAH level series sponsors, Norman Benzaquen, Naomi and Peter Neustadter, the Solomon family, and Oliver Stanton. HEKHAL series sponsors, an anonymous sponsor, and Stan and Madelene Towne. RIMONIM series sponsors, the Agus Family, an anonymous series sponsor, another anonymous series sponsor, Anu, the Museum of the Jewish People, Karen and Jack Daar, and Raquel Smith Herz and Stephen Herz. TAMID series sponsors, Louis Bateman, Gail Propp and Sharon Dane, Carol and Arthur Goldberg, Rachel Newmark Herlands and Jonathan Herlands, Juan Mesa-Freydell, the Nathan family, the Reisman family, Carol and Alan Schechter, and the young Israel of Scarsdale. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all the series sponsors. And I also want to thank those that are sponsoring tonight's talk. Luchot, sponsors of tonight's talk, Alexandra and Shalom Silber. Etz Hayyim sponsors, Debbie and David Sable. Yad sponsors, Joyce and David Friedman, Lydia E. Mark, Gail and Stephen Spira, Aviva and Marvin Sussman, and Marion and William Weiss. And Kahal Kodesh, sponsors of tonight's talk, the Burke family, Renee and Avram Schreiber, and Malka and Josh Katzen. In July of 2016, the Jews of Venice marked the 500th anniversary of their city's Jewish ghetto, the entrance to which can be seen in picture 1, which is being put on the screen. Now, of course, the ghetto itself, the walls of the ghetto, which were created by Venetian decree in 1516, had long since been opened up after the conquest of Venice by Napoleonic forces. But what was being commemorated was 500 years of a community, because as we shall see, it is with the creation of the ghetto that Jewish presence in Venice was actually endowed with permanence. And strikingly, a great part of the focus of the events held as this 500th anniversary was marked, a great part of the way in which these Jews pondered the history of the Jews of Venice, was through a focus on a play by a man who had never been to their city and did not know any Jews. And that is Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, with emphasis on the famous scene that occurs within a Venice courtroom. The Merchant of Venice tells of, among other plots, the story of Shylock, a Jewish moneylender who hates the Venetian merchant Antonio because Antonio treats Shylock the way many Venetians treated Jews. As Shylock says, "You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine." And so in the play, Shylock seeks to exact revenge on Antonio. After loaning him money and Antonio incurring a debt, Shylock seeks famously to take a pound of flesh from Antonio. In Shakespeare's era, the play was composed as a comedy, with Shylock, the villain of the play, ultimately undone by the heroine Portia, who, disguised in the courtroom, gives a famous speech which essentially describes Christians as merciful and Jews as not. The actual play, the way it was titled often, and this you could see in picture 2 now on the screen, the play depicts Jews as hateful, hell-bent on revenge, or as the old title has it, the most excellent history of the merchant of Venice with the extreme cruelty of Shylock, the Jew. Therefore, as the scholar John Gross put it, quote, invested with Shakespearean power and in time with Shakespearean prestige, Shylock, the Jewish villain, became part of world mythology. He may not have added anything to existing stereotypes, but as the most famous Jewish character in literature, he helped to spread them and to keep them vigorously alive. He belongs inescapably to the history of anti-Semitism, end quote. Thus, the events of the 500th anniversary commemoration included, in Venice, a famous actor reciting the "Hath not a Jew eyes" passage, Shakespearean scholars discussing the play, and famous jurists reconsidering the court scene. And if we seek tonight to better reflect on the history of Venetian Jewry by making a connection between Shakespeare's infamous play and the story of the Jewish community in that city, we should also, I believe, look to another scene in The Merchant of Venice, one that is usually overlooked. It is the synagogues of Venice that bring us together tonight. And, though many do not know this, Shakespeare's play itself makes mention of the synagogues of Venice. This is seen in the beginning of Act 3. And this is again picture 2 in one of the panels on the screen. Shylock is speaking with a fellow Jew whose name is Tubal. Shakespeare gives the Jews names that they would never actually give themselves. And he's discussing his daughter Jessica, who has left Judaism and run away with Shylock's money to elope with a Christian. Shakespeare depicts Shylock as more upset at losing his money than his daughter, saying, "Thou stickest a dagger in me, I shall never see my gold again." Shylock also discusses how Jessica has stolen a ring of his, which she has utilized to purchase a pet monkey. But even here, even with this terribly anti-Semitic scene, even here, as with the "Hath not a Jew eyes" passage, Shakespeare cannot help but humanize Shylock a bit. Unlike Shakespeare's contemporary Christopher Marlowe's play The Jew of Malta, Shakespeare, even in a play laden with anti-Semitic tropes, cannot give a unidimensional character, and so he has Shylock make mention of the fact that the ring once belonged to his beloved wife. Shylock's friend Tubal in this scene tells Shylock that Antonio cannot pay back Shylock's loan, which, according to the agreement, would then allow Shylock to take a pound of flesh from Antonio. And Shylock in the scene delights in the bloodletting yet to come. And we can show this again in picture 2 in the passage from the scene. Shylock says, "I am very glad of it. I'll plague him. I'll torture him." And he adds, "I will have the heart of him." And then if you look at the last line in the scene, picture 2, the scene concludes with Shylock saying the following: "Go, go, Tubal, and meet me at our synagogue. Go, good Tubal, at our synagogue." End of scene. Act 3, Scene 1. At our synagogue. Shakespeare surely intended this statement from Shylock to sound sinister, but the fact is that for all the preposterous phrases that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of Shylock, for all the calumnies on the Jews that come from this character, and for all the terrible damage that the play's depiction of Shylock has done to the Jewish people, the fact is there is one line in the play that the Jews of Venice would certainly have said, and that is, "At our synagogue. I will see you at our synagogue." For given that this was a community that was really only several 4,000 to 5,000 at its fullest, this tiny group of Jews packed into an even tinier, insufficient space in the ghetto had some truly exquisite synagogues, a sign of the love that they lavished on those sacred sites. And the synagogues themselves in construction and decoration highlighted the striking diversity of that community. 5 synagogues reflecting the diverse backgrounds of the Jews of Venice themselves. So for example, if a Venetian Jew was an Ashkenazi, or as he might have been called then, Tedeschi, then the synagogue to which that Jew might have gone could have been the Grand German Schola or synagogue, or perhaps the Canton synagogue. Were he Italian, he might have gone to the Italian synagogue in the same complex in the very same section of the ghetto. Or perhaps this Jew in Venice might have been a Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jew who had come to Venice from the Ottoman regions. Then he might have gone to the Levantine synagogue. Or if one was a descendant of Portuguese Jewish conversos, then he might have gone to the Grand Spanish synagogue. Today, when one visits Venice, it is of course nothing like it once was. The walls themselves went down with the emancipation, which the Jews of Venice saw as the dawning of a new age of freedom. And then, as the Holocaust memorial plaque in the ghetto tells us, the Jews were to discover that there were even greater evils, much worse evils, ahead. But the true testament that remains in the ghetto today to what Jewish life once was is the synagogues. And so if we wish to discover what Venetian Jewish life was like, we must, to paraphrase Shylock, meet at the synagogues. But to meet at the synagogues in a different way than we've previously met throughout the series. Our lectures up to this point have focused on one specific edifice every week: the Yesnoga, the Altnoi, TORAH, the Ramoshul. But tonight it's not so much the unique features of one synagogue that we'll be uncovering, though each one is fascinating in itself. Rather, we'll be focusing on the fact that they are all together in a small area of what was once the ghetto inside a pretty small area that was the Republic of Venice, joining in unity at most 4,000 to 5,000 Jews of dazzling diversity, which is why the synagogues themselves in the Venice ghetto embody Klal Yisrael in microcosm, and why Venice's intellectual impact on the Jewish world is actually far beyond its size. Thus, a study of the Jewish community of the Venice ghetto is an appropriate subject with which to conclude our series, for I think it will teach us a great deal, in fact, about our own age, and why to rediscover the synagogues of the world here at the Anu Museum is so meaningful and moving. So let's begin by describing the origins and makeup of the Venice ghetto, and here at this point, as throughout this lecture, I'm tremendously indebted to 2 books. First, the well-known volume The Ghetto of Venice by Riccardo Calamani, and the amazing new book by the historian Jane Gerber, Cities of Splendor in the Shaping of Sephardi History. Our story begins in 1516 when a charter by Venice's Senate granted the Jews the legal ability to live and stay in Venice, but only on condition that they were confined every night to a part of the city that was walled up. At least according to one theory, the site that was selected was once a foundry or ghetto, and that is how the term ghetto took on a whole new meaning, for Venice was the first Jewish ghetto. For us, the very term ghetto reflects the long legacy of anti-Semitism, discrimination, persecution, and of course this is the case. But this declaration creating the ghetto also embodied in 1516 an official recognition of the Jewish legal ability to stay in Venice. It meant that they would be allowed to live there and build lives and not be expelled. And what the Jews saw, as scholars note, as the relatively stable nature of the republican politics of Venice gave the Jews hope that their place in the city would be endowed with permanence. The original ghetto, and therefore the official legal ability of residency, was extended to the Jews that were in Venice in 1516, a community made up of Ashkenazim and Italian Jews, a group that together were known as Tedeschi or German. It is they that were legally seen as the permanent residents of Venice by the Republic. And their professions, based on what they had been before they were officially allowed to stay, were extremely limited. They would have followed the pre-ghetto status quo and would have had professions, as historians note, such as pawnbroking and, of course, money lending, something that was seen by Venice as economically necessary for the Jews to provide, and yet was also a source of Venetian anger and anti-Semitism at those very same Jews. People always think, who don't actually read the play and study it, that the merchant of Venice is Shylock. But of course, that's not Shylock. The merchant of Venice is a Christian. That's Antonio. Shylock is a moneylender because he can't be a merchant of Venice. Then there were the Levantine Jews, Jews of the Ottoman Empire. They arrived some years after 1516 and were seen as a source of mercantile connection to the larger world. And they were then joined by other Sephardim that were descendants of conversos and were known at times as Western Sephardi Jews. These Sephardim were allowed to take place in Venice commerce as long as they too lived in the ghetto, on the understanding that de jure, if not de facto, they weren't actually living there, they were just passing through. Thus, these Jews had greater economic opportunity, and while they might have engaged in professions like pawnbroking or moneylending, many of them could also be merchants, but of course, technically, these Jews would be merchants in Venice, but not merchants of Venice. Another section was added for these Sephardic Jews to the ghetto, and all was walled up as one. A little confusingly, the original Jews lived in what's called the new ghetto, the Ghetto Nuovo, and the Sephardim lived in the added section that was called the Old Ghetto, or the Ghetto Vecchio, with a third, much smaller section added later. Now, on the one hand, these two portions of the ghetto, the new ghetto, where the older community was, and the old ghetto, where the newer part of the community was located, were very different. Jane Gerber succinctly summarizes what set them apart. Quote, "The two sections of the ghetto differed in tempo and commercial character, as well as in the ethnic background of their residents. The streets of the Nuovo, housing the Ashkenazi and Italian old clothes dealers and their pawn shops, were crowded during the day, bustling with Christian customers from outside the ghetto. In contrast, the Ghetto Vecchio was more tranquil. Many of its inhabitants worked at the port and in the main business section of the city and were therefore absent from the ghetto," end quote. And this, as Jane Gerber explains, is because, again, technically the Sephardic Jews, both the Levantine and Western ones, were not actually residents of Venice officially, even though they may have lived there for many, many years. The ghetto is therefore, at first glance at least, two parts reflecting two very different Jewish communities. It's therefore to be expected that the synagogues themselves in these respective sections will reflect these differences. Let's see how this is so. We start with the synagogues in the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto. And though the synagogues are all next to each other, they each reflect the unique Ashkenazic or Italian traditions of the Jews who gathered within them. For example, we have the Great German Synagogue, or the Scuola Grande Tedesca, and this is picture number 3. As you see from the sweep of the interior, the synagogue inside is exquisite. And yet, if you look at what the building, if you look at how the building appeared outside, this is picture 4, you'll see that it is not discernible as a sanctuary at all. Another example in this section of the ghetto is the Canton Synagogue, called the Canton perhaps because that means corner, and it was on the corner of an edifice. If you look at picture 4 again, you'll see two different very beautiful arcs. The one with the red is from the German synagogue, and the one that is all gold is from the Canton Synagogue. The Canton Synagogue, along with this beautiful arc, had a truly lovely bima featuring wood carvings that were made to look like branches, which surely I think is meant to symbolize the Torah as being a tree of life. But again, with the Canton Synagogue on the outside, all one would see is a small opening at the roof, a sort of little dome over where the bima was, as a sign that the bima is there. And that also meant, by the way, that for Jews living in a very cramped series of essentially apartments, the synagogue, which were at the top, would be less stuffy than elsewhere. I actually saw that the New York Times quoted Israeli artist David Landau, who commented that the Venetian synagogue structure made everyone religious because it was only in the synagogue that people actually got any air. I don't know how serious he was, but that was depicting what it was like to go into the synagogue. You would actually, in the cramped nature of the ghetto, feel a little bit fresh air, unlike in other places. Be that as it may, in this section of the ghetto there are 3 synagogues, the Italian, the Canton, and the Grand German, but they all from the outside do not look like a synagogue at all. The same cannot be said for the Sephardic section. Thus we have the Levantine synagogue, or Levantine Skola, and this is picture number 5. And you can also look at picture number 6, and you will see both that it is exquisite inside and out. The beautiful Venetian architecture, which was built, according to Kalamani, at the time when the first Ottoman Jews entered the city. Its exterior is as magnificent as its interior. And then there is also a palatial structure, which is the splendid Spanish synagogue. And this is picture number 7. As Jane Gerber puts it, quote, in contrast to the inconspicuous Tedeschi synagogues, the 2 synagogues of the Sephardi Jews, Scuola Levantina and the Scuola Grande Spagnola, are large freestanding structures and that closely resemble some of the opulent palaces of the nobility that line the Grand Canal. They were built in the 16th century, renovated and enlarged to their present size in the 17th and 18th centuries, and have since undergone considerable restoration. The 2 edifices face each other on a small square in the Ghetto Vecchio known as the Campiello delle Scuole, the little square of the synagogues. Their grandeur and elegance attest to the affluence of their mercantile Sephardic founders and suggest a sense of security and self-confidence. The Scuola Grande Spagnola is the most impressive structure in the ghetto, reflecting the status and size of the ghetto's Sephardic population. Let's look at picture 7 again. And hosted most community events. Remember, the sanctuary that you see hosted most community events. Remember that? She writes and concludes, the ghetto, it hosted most community events. She writes that it reflected, quote, the status and size of the ghetto Sephardic population, Jane Gerber writes, and hosted most community events, the ghetto self-governing bodies, and many of its charitable institutions, end quote. Here then, synagogues are meant to look resplendent inside and out. To study the magnificent interiors and exteriors of the grand Sephardic synagogues is to see the wealth and the connections and culture of Sephardic Jewry at that time. Thus, as the book Cities of Splendor notes, one of the most interesting rabbis in Jewish history, the Venetian rabbi Leon de Modena, described how, speaking in the Spanish synagogue one Sabbath, quote, in attendance were the brother of the King of France, who was accompanied by some French noblemen and by 5 of the most important Christian preachers who gave sermons that Pentecost. God put such learned words in my mouth that all were very pleased, including many of the Christians who were present, end quote. So you have a grand synagogue visited by royalty. An event like this could have happened in a grand Sephardic synagogue elsewhere in the West. Indeed, something like that did happen at the Esnoga in Amsterdam. At the same time, even as we note the differences between the grand synagogues of the Sephardim in the ghetto and the synagogues that are exquisite inside but not outside in the Ashkenazic section of the ghetto, even as we note these differences, we'd be remiss if we sought to see the synagogues of Venice as merely separate institutions that have nothing to do with each other. Ashkenaz here, Sfarad here, Italian there. For recall what we quoted from Jane Gerber's Cities of Splendor about how the Spanish synagogue was the site where the governing institutions of Venice Jewry would meet. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we discover something amazing. Because the Jews of Venice were united in a series of interlocking governing institutions that brought them together, that joined them together in a system utterly unlike anywhere in the Jewish world. One which truly synthesized the full array of Jewish life and culture in the ghetto itself. Let's briefly outline how this worked. Each one of the groups of Jews had their own institutional body, Ashkenaz, Italian, Levantine, Western Sephardic, that would oversee their own segments within the community, but they also, all these Jews, formed a larger legislature of sorts that reflected the entire community. First, there was a larger body called the Kahal Gadol, which proportionally represented the different parts of the community. And then this Kahal Gadol, in turn, elected a smaller, higher governing body of leaders that were Parnasim, who engaged in everyday leadership. That group was known as the Kahal Katan. And who was in the Vad Gadol? Kalamani tells us, based on earlier authorities, that in 1594, quote, the assembly comprised about 70 Venetian Jews, plus the 6 leaders of the Jewish community and 11 Jews from the mainland and who represented most of the rural settlements. In the 17th century, the Kahal Gadol consisted of 60 Western Jews, 12 Levantine, and 40 German Jews, just over 100 people. And he further tells us that, quote, by 1663, the various groups in the ghetto were already fairly well integrated. The executive council, the Vad Katan, consisted of 7 members, 3 German, 3 Western, and 1 Levantine Jew, end quote. So what this means is that even as there were 2 different main sections of the ghetto and 5 synagogues, each with their own identity and characteristics, there was still incredible unity. And what we should actually be thinking about when we study and look at the beautiful Spanish synagogue is we need to imagine the meeting of the Kahal and all that it embodied. Jews governing together, working together, and most importantly, learning together, because we know that Leon de Modena also preached and prayed in all the synagogues of Venice. And therefore, what took place within that synagogue as all of the Jews met together, what took place there embodies the spirit of unity and diversity in Venice that took place simultaneously. For the model of Venetian Jewry is the joining together of different traditions. And this may well be singular, or at least rare. The odd thing is that by and large in many other areas of the West where both Sfaradim and Ashkenazim lived, they created separate parallel institutions, and at certain points even defined themselves partially in contradistinction to the other. If you read Stephen Nadler's wonderful portrait of Jewish Amsterdam, you'll be inspired by certain aspects of the community, which we discussed in this series. A glorious kehillah that emerged out of nothing to become a symbol of faith and spiritual splendor. But you'll also be somewhat shocked, or maybe you won't be shocked, by Nadler's description of the disdain with which the 2 different communities, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, would often look at each other, and the way they would at times, one might seek to separate from the other. There's a reason why the oldest Jewish joke is about the Jewish castaway who builds 2 synagogues on the desert island so that there's one that he does not go to. And this was thought to be only a joke until the early 2000s during the Afghanistan war, when articles were written about the last 2 Jews in Afghanistan. And the article was about how they didn't get along with each other and how I think they prayed on 2 different floors of the same synagogue. And even when there was no hostility, like in England, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim in the 18th century would have their own communal systems. And patterns like this are found, even, as Jane Gerber notes, in what ultimately came to be seen as the larger world of Sfarad, the communities of the Middle East known as Edot HaMizrach that were joined with the Spanish exiles. As Cities of Splendor notes, the arriving Spanish Jews were not often immediately welcomed by the communities that were already there, who had their own traditions and identity. In contrast, Jane Gerber writes, quote, Venice was the first important city in which Ashkenazim, Italian Jews, Sfaradim from the Levant, and former conversos from Portugal were organized in separate units, but lived in one ghetto and acted as one community. The Venetian model of Jewish self-governance was instructive to other communities. In a confined space, the Jews hammered out a viable, working community, generally acting as one body in vital manners, such as apportioning tax contributions and ransoming captives, following a system of proportional representations within their governing council, end quote. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as I read this, in a strange way, as I studied these descriptions, in which each community has its own body, but then it's joined in this larger legislature, I thought strangely of a course I teach about something that seems totally different, which is a course I teach about the Federalist Papers, about the American system of government, because it describes how each state has its own identity, and then there's legislatures that bring them together. Ashkenazim here have their group, Italians have their group, each part of the Sephardic community have their own group, but then they're joined in lower and upper houses, like a House and Senate, that represent the full diversity of these quote-unquote states, but brings them all together. And there's a real point here, I think, because American federalism is meant to be a way in which different people are able to come together, engage each other, without denying their differences. And it was the original federated legislatures of Venice that were so admired by and it was the original legislatures of Venice, which also had, as it were, a lower and higher, to simplify a much more complex system, a lower and higher house. It was the political system of Venice that actually impressed Jews and one specific rabbi. For consider, in the age before the ghetto, Don Isaac Abravanel arrived in Venice at the end of his long and fascinating and difficult and extraordinary life. serving the Venetian Republic in a way that when he died, the leaders of Venice honored him at his death. And Abravanel himself also fell in love with the Venetian system, a love so profound that it impacted his interpretation of a Torah passage in a manner which, to my knowledge, has no parallel. This reading has been noted by historians, both within Venice and without, and it involves Yitro's suggestion to Moshe that he, as leader, appoint under him Sarei Alafim, Sarei Meot, Sarei Chamishim, Sarei Asarot, which is usually interpreted as a leader over 1,000, a leader over 100, a leader over 50, a leader over 10, etc. But Abravanel insists, as Kalamani and Benzaquen Netanyahu in his biography of Abravanel notes, Abravanel insists that actually what this means is that Moses made legislatures, lower houses of 1,000, 150, and a higher one of 10, with Moshe above all. And he says, just like the system in Venice, or somewhat like the system in Venice. Abravanel seemed to feel that Moshe would only create the best political system. But the best political system was clearly the Venetian system. So it has to be that Moshe must create a system that in some way parallels that of Venice. And intriguingly, inside the ghetto, the Jews of Venice did parallel Venice. Each faction oversaw itself, but they came together in one body, as one people, one faith, with a lower legislature and a higher legislature. And so if the Spanish Synagogue of Venice was a meeting place for the governmental gatherings of the inner Jewish leadership, then we have a striking example of how Venetian Jews themselves were able to create a system, if I can steal a phrase from Rabbi Sachs, a system that embodied integration without assimilation, which allowed for difference, but also unity. And we as Jews know how rare that is. Natan Sharansky tells a story of once he was speaking to his neighbor in Israel, and his neighbor was remembering the feeling of unity among Jews that was felt during the Soviet Jewry movement. And she says to him, she said to Sharansky, Natan, she said to him something like, Natan, it was such a great time when you were in prison. In other words, because we felt so united. And Sharansky said something like, I'm glad that was a good time for you, but I'm not going back to prison, and Jews will have to find a different reason to love one another. The truth is that in the joining together of the Jews of all the synagogues, Venice created a community unlike any other, engaging each other, learning from each other, as well as engaging the larger culture and the opportunities that were in Venice in many ways that would ultimately profoundly impact the Jewish world. Time does not allow for a listing of all the examples, but mention must be made of perhaps the most important one, which is emphasized in all books about Jewish Venice, which is publishing. It was in Venice that Daniel Bomberg, a Christian printer, employed the Jews of Venice to create one of the most important Jewish publishing houses in our history. Inspired by the earlier Italian Jewish printing of Cincino, Venice became a center of Sfarim, leading to Jews from around the world to learn from one another. If you learn Talmud, you know that the Talmud is laid out and published in the way that Venice in part helped popularize for the Jewish world, is that you open up a Talmud and you suddenly discover the diverse backgrounds and methods of learning and living of learning Torah that existed in Jewish history. And you learn how they can engage each other, enhance each other, enlighten each other. So for example, to learn a volume of Talmud today is to study the words of the Babylonian rabbis, and then you would study Rashi and Tosafot, and the early giants who are the early giants of Ashkenaz in France. And then you turn to the back to see the reflections of Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who fled medieval Germany to become a rabbi in Toledo, in the very synagogue commemorated by the wall behind me right now, bringing the Torah of Ashkenaz and of his Rebbe, the Maram of Rutenberg, to the world of Sephardic Jewry. Then you go to the back beyond the Rosh, and you'll see the legal summaries of Rif, Yitzchak Alfasi, and who was one of the most influential figures in Sephardic halacha, and then arrayed around it one will see Nachmanides of northern Spain, Ra'avad of Pasquier, and others. All this might take time to develop, and there are surely a variety of factors that brought us to the form of learning that we know today, but there is no question that Venice played a role, and this point is made by the book Cities of Splendor, which tells us, quote, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim were brought into dialogue with one another through the printed word. Bomberg's printing house brought Sephardi commentaries, Italian sermons, medieval philosophical traditions, and even the scientific studies of Padua's famed medical faculty to a new and wider audience. Yeshiva students in Krakow, Christian burghers in Amsterdam, and Jewish scholars in Constantinople were for the first time exposed to some of the same Jewish voices. As David Ruderman has convincingly argued, the print revolution shattered the localized Jewish traditions of medieval times, making Jews of all backgrounds, not just those in rabbinic circles, more aware of one another, end quote. So, to learn Torah is always to engage in what Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik called, to experience what Rabbi Soloveichik called the Symposium of Generations. And in Venice, the Symposium of Generations were truly opened up to the Jewish world. And this learning is part of the legacy of the sacred synagogues of Venice that we celebrate tonight. These synagogues were known not as synagogues, but schools, just like the Yiddish shul, because the center for Jewish life is not only praying, but learning. The book, Cities of Splendor cites a famous piece of halachic and ritual argument by Rabbi Leon de Modena, who made the case for a form of ritual experience that was controversial at the time, but which did occur in at least certain synagogues of Venice, but unknown at the time in much of the larger Jewish world, which was choirs, choral music. De Modena was an ardent admirer of the Mantuan Jewish composer whose music is so central to Shearith Israel, Salomone de Rosse Hebreo. But for many, choral music was a dangerous innovation. But de Modena argued that, quote, one should praise God with whatever talents he has bestowed upon one, and surely it is meritorious in one with a sweet voice to raise it up in song to him. And if such a person were joined by several others with equally good voices, surely this would bring about even more devoted prayer to God, end quote. This is a wonderful argument. If one beautiful voice is good, surely two in harmony is even better. And this provides us with a meaningful metaphor. I would argue that more than any other diaspora community on earth, it was in Venice that the voices of Judaism blended with each other, enhanced each other. Kalamani gives us a good sense of the diversity that would be found in the Kehillah. Quote, a variety of tongues was heard in the ghetto. Hebrew chants and Mediterranean dialects were superimposed on the colorful tones of Spanish, Turkish, Portuguese, and Greek, along with the argot spoken by some of the Polish and German refugees, and with the many Italian dialects. A true babel of people and tongues, where adventurers and ambiguous Muranos stood out, different in everything, even to the color and style of their garments, living testimonials to the costumes of far-off lands. The rhythm of daily prayer was marked by the traditional morning, afternoon, and evening prayers, and at night by the closing of the gates and the boat making its rounds on the canals. The great square, a center of Jewish and Christian life during the day, after dark became a sort of independent Jewish republic in the heart of Venice, end quote. In other words, one might say that the rhythm of the pulse of the ghetto, of the life of the Jewish community of the ghetto, was the Jews saying to each other the words that Shakespeare might have intended to sound sinister, but actually when Jews said them were said with so much warmth and light and love. To the synagogue, and then after the evening prayer, all would go from their synagogues and join as one. The Jewish community of the Venice ghetto was a glorious Jewish community. Persecuted, yes. Locked up, yes. Surrounded by many who often hated them, yes. Patrolled by guards and by boats for which they themselves had to pay yes. But the community itself, its voices, what may have sounded like a cacophony was actually a choir, because rightly understood it was an array of Jewish life that featured in one small spot, a variety of Jewish voices from around the world. None of this, of course, is in The Merchant of Venice. In giving us the caricature that was the vengeful Shylock, Shakespeare missed out entirely on the glory that was Venetian Jewry. Now, as we noted, Shakespeare did not know any Jews, at least not any open Jews. There was no Jewish community in England. And Shakespeare, in writing this play, Shakespeare, who usually has a brilliant understanding of human nature, Shakespeare, in writing The Merchant of Venice, was asking himself, if I was a Jew who, like Shylock, is spat on constantly by someone like Antonio, what would I be like? If I had to pay out of my own funds for the quote-unquote right to live in a ghetto, if I had to fund the very guards and boats that ensured that I was locked up at night, if I was a Jew looked down upon and forced to live in indignity, what would be going through my mind? For Shakespeare, Shylock is the answer to that question. Shakespeare's assuming that Jews would be filled with rage and a desire for revenge. Thus, Shakespeare has Shylock say, The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. In other words, Shakespeare, having known no Jews, takes it for granted that Jews, if they were treated by others like animals, Shakespeare believed that Jews would become like animals. Or in Shylock's words, thou calledst me a dog before thou hadst a cause, but since I am a dog, beware my fangs. Shakespeare's way of thinking is an attempt to get into the mind of Jews that he did not know. And Shakespeare is assuming that because they were constantly mistreated, they would be turned into the vengeful figures that we see in the character of Shylock. But Shakespeare was wrong, and Shylock as a character is a calumny, because unlike the bard's imagination, the Jews did not become like Shylock. They did not become vengeful animals. They did not become vengeful animal-like individuals. And part of marking the history of the Jewish community of Venice is to illustrate to everyone how Shakespeare, despite his usual humanist intuition, usually uncannily correct, got the Jews of Venice so profoundly wrong. And why was he wrong? How did Jews resist the anti-Semitism that they experienced in Venice and throughout the world? How did they not become Shylock? How did they not become what Shakespeare assumed they would become? The answer, of course, can be found in many different parts of Jewish life, but certainly significantly in the synagogues that we are celebrating. The Jews of Venice, as they went out into the city during the day, were, like Shylock, indeed called misbelievers, dogs. They were forced to wear special clothing, and no doubt, like Shylock, their clothing was often spat upon. But inside these communities, we find sources of holiness, love, and life. Jews in Venice, as elsewhere, saw life as a privilege, as an opportunity to sanctify their world through Torah and mitzvot. And the Jews of Venice, more than any other diaspora community perhaps, because of its diversity and unity, would have made manifest their understanding how the privilege that is Jewish life binds all Jews metaphysically together. The book Cities of Splendor tells us what should be remembered as one visits what are now some of the empty synagogues of Venice. Quote, this is what once was, quote, the bitterness of daily ghetto life was sweetened by a host of organizations and confraternities dedicated to study, sociability, and the performance of various charitable works. Funds for poor widows, dowries for unmarried women, visiting the sick, clothing the indigent, preparing the deceased for ritually proper burials, and ransoming captives. The names of some of these societies are carved in stone collection boxes still embedded in the walls of the deserted synagogue antechambers. And Jane Gerber continues, organized prayer groups of especially pious individuals would meet before dawn for daily worship, end quote. Study, prayer, sociability. If Shakespeare had wanted to truly understand the mind of the Jew in general, and the Jew of Venice in particular, he would have found the answer in the one truly authentic line that he placed in Shylock's mouth, to the synagogue, to the synagogue. The ghetto of Venice, like other ghettos, bears the legacy of anti-Semitism and injustice, and it's so important to remember this. But remembering the Jews of the Venice ghetto also means remembering how wrong Shakespeare was, and how within the walls, the Jews of the ghetto embodied Jewish unity, unlike perhaps any other Jewish community in the diaspora. It's fitting, therefore, that just recently the New York Times reported that a group of Jews are seeking specifically to preserve the synagogues of Venice, an effort that is being driven by the Israeli artist David Landau, and the article tells us that, quote, these days the number of Jews in Venice has dwindled to 450 and the synagogues have fallen into disrepair, but an effort is underway to rejuvenate the three most needy of them, restoring the wooden pews, cleaning the terrazzo floors, and repairing the painted ceilings, end quote. These are the three of the new ghetto, of the Tedeschi community, of the Tedeschi part of the community. And the point, as the article explains, is to remember the Jews of Venice for the lives they lived, how they lived lives of holiness and devotion in the face of challenges and threats. But then, ladies and gentlemen, the very same article describing some of the enhancements to the synagogue building that has taken place in Venice today in the 21st century, we are told as follows, quote, "Given the ongoing risks of anti-Semitic violence, security systems are being created in consultation with Israeli security officials," Landau said, "with bulletproof windows on the ground floor," end quote. The legacy of anti-Semitism is not gone and irrelevant at all, is not irrelevant at all. The legacy of anti-Semitism is not irrelevant at all in discussions today about Jews in Venice and Jews in Europe. Today's Jews still need to worry, and they worry about something much worse than someone spitting on their Jewish gabardine. In the face of all this, we continue to remember how wrong Shakespeare was. We treasure the legacy of all the Jews who have come before. And in closing our series, we can, in an unexpected way, inspire ourselves with the words from the play The Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare had Shylock say, "to the synagogue," and in a sense, that's what we have done. Because the synagogues of Venice and the synagogues of the world are our synagogues. And as marked in this very room at the Anu Museum, these synagogues are so important to who we are, and it is the fellowship of the Jews of Venice that has further taught us that this is so. We bring the series of sanctuaries and cities to a close in a room that preserves the legacy of sanctuaries of cities, and thereby the memory of the grandeur and longings and loves of the Jews throughout history. As I was writing and finishing to write this lecture last night, I was sitting on a plane in London, and the plane was delayed before takeoff. It was announced it was going to be a delay. And I was reading and writing about Venice and about the Jews who lived close together, diverse but united. And somebody came over and asked me to join in evening services, Arbit. And so I got up, and a diverse group of Jews on the plane flying from London to Eretz Yisrael gathered together, and in the small chamber between two parts of the plane, we crowded together and we prayed together. I heard everyone, and our pronunciations of the Hebrew were all different from one another, but the prayers were all the same, and the faith was all the same. I felt as if God was sending me a message. Today, especially in the state of Israel, the Jewish people, in a much larger way, face a wonderful challenge, learning from each other, from the different traditions within the history of the Jewish people, the different traditions and the different ways in which synagogues were sanctified and in which synagogues were prayed, and the different ways in which Jews prayed inside the synagogues. Learning from one another to further weave an enriched tapestry of Jewish life by listening and the challenge of listening to voices that still echo throughout the halls of this room, so that Jews can bring a choir of the Jewish people into being. And as the Jews of this age are called to seek to do so, it is the Jews of Venice who have shown the way. Thank you very much.